In his opulent mansion, the millionaire secretly observed Grace, his quiet cook. That moment sparked their unexpected passion. Grace moved silently through the kitchen, her movements efficient, almost robotic. She sliced vegetables, stirred pots, and plated food, all while the clinking of cutlery and the muffled conversations from the dining room echoed in the background. The mansion's kitchen was enormous, a stark contrast to her own small kitchen at home. Polished countertops, stainless steel appliances, and shelves filled with ingredients she'd never have at home. She kept her head down, avoiding the glances of the other staff. Mr. James, the owner of the house, was in the dining room with guests. Grace rarely saw him up close, but she felt his presence in the way the rest of the staff moved when he was around, tense and precise. The phone rang suddenly, the harsh sound cutting through the kitchen noise. Grace paused, her knife hovering above a cucumber. Her heart sank as she glanced at the clock. It was too late for casual calls. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the receiver. "Hello, this is Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ms. Grace, this is the school," the voice on the other end said. "I'm calling about your children's tuition. The payment is overdue, and if it's not settled soon, we won't be able to allow them to attend classes next month." Grace felt her throat tighten. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath before responding. "I understand. I'll see what I can do." She hung up, her hands trembling slightly. She turned back to the counter, trying to focus on the vegetables in front of her. But her mind was racing. How was she going to pay for the school? She was already working as many hours as she could, and still, it wasn't enough. "Grace, are you okay?" It was Maria, one of the other cooks, standing next to her, concern in her eyes. Grace forced a smile, nodding. "I'm fine, just a bit tired." Maria looked like she wanted to say more, but she just nodded and returned to her station. Grace could feel the tears threatening to fall, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down here. Not now. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Grace moved mechanically, her body going through the motions while her mind was somewhere else. By the time the dinner service was over, her feet were aching, and her eyes felt heavy. She leaned against the counter, taking a moment to catch her breath. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed James standing in the doorway, watching her. He wasn't saying anything, just observing. Grace quickly straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron again, pretending not to notice him. She knew James was the kind of man who noticed everything, but he rarely spoke to the staff directly. He was always polite, always distant. She wondered what he thought when he looked at her, if he even thought anything at all. Later, in the small break room, Grace sat down next to Maria. They shared a cup of tea, and for a moment, it felt almost normal. Maria turned to her, her voice quiet. "You seemed really down earlier. Is everything all right at home?" Grace sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's just, the school called today. I can't keep up with the payments, and I don't know what to do." Her voice broke, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. Maria put a hand on her arm. "Grace, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do?" Grace shook her head. "No, but thank you. It's just been hard since my husband left. I thought I'd be able to manage, but every time I think I'm getting ahead, something pulls me back." Maria squeezed her arm, her eyes full of sympathy. "You know, you're doing the best you can. And your kids, they know that too." Grace nodded, but the words felt hollow. She wished she could believe that. That night, when Grace got home, she found her kids asleep on the couch, the TV still on. She turned it off, brushing a hand through her son's hair. She looked at them, her heart aching. She wanted to give them everything. But right now, she could barely give them enough. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through every possible solution. She thought about asking for extra shifts, but she was already exhausted. She thought about borrowing money, but she had no one to ask. The weight of it all felt crushing, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep carrying it alone. Morning came too soon. Grace pulled herself out of bed, her body aching from the restless night. She got the kids ready, made breakfast, and walked them to the bus stop. Her daughter hugged her tightly before getting on the bus. "Bye, Mommy. I love you." Grace smiled, waving as the bus drove away. "I love you too, sweetheart." She took a deep breath, turning to head back to the mansion. She had another long day ahead of her, and she needed to keep it together, no matter how hard it got. James sat at the long dining table, surrounded by his guests. Their laughter filled the room, but his eyes kept drifting to the kitchen door. He caught glimpses of Grace moving in and out, her face worn and tired. He knew all his staff, but there was something about Grace that made her stand out. Something in the way she moved, as if the weight of the world rested on her shoulders. He couldn't quite explain it, but it bothered him. Later that day, while passing through the hallway, James spotted an envelope on the kitchen counter. It had the school's logo on it. He watched as Grace picked it up, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. She read it quickly, and he saw her shoulders slump. She put the letter in her pocket, her face pale. She turned to continue cooking, but he could tell she was struggling to keep her emotions in check. Grace took a deep breath, her back turned to him. James stayed quiet, observing her. She seemed lost, almost defeated. When she thought no one was looking, she let out a soft sigh. She leaned against the counter, just for a moment, and closed her eyes. James had seen enough people over the years to know the look on her face. Pure exhaustion. He watched her lift her head and continue working, her expression carefully blank. She was hiding something, but he didn't know what. As evening approached, Grace busied herself with the dinner preparations. She chopped vegetables, stirred sauces, and tasted dishes. But her hands weren't as steady as usual, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. She was distracted. James walked into the kitchen, his footsteps barely making a sound. He stood in the doorway, watching as she carefully arranged plates. When she turned slightly, he caught sight of her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, her lips pressed tightly together as if to hold back a sob. She quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand, not noticing him. He stepped back, unsure of what to do. He wanted to help, but how? James had always been good at fixing problems, but this was different. This wasn't a business matter he could solve with a quick phone call or a signature on a check. This was personal, and it required a gentler touch. Grace continued her work, unaware of his presence. He watched as she finished arranging the plates, her hands moving slower now, almost hesitant. She looked exhausted, worn down by whatever was weighing on her. He could see it in her eyes, in the way her shoulders slumped just slightly. James left the kitchen quietly, his mind racing. He needed to do something, but he couldn't just walk in and demand she tell him everything. She deserved her privacy. But there had to be a way to help. Some small gesture that would let her know she wasn't alone. That night, after the guests had left, James lingered in his study. He could hear the faint sounds of the staff cleaning up, and he imagined Grace among them, tidying up the kitchen. He could still picture her face, the tears she had tried so hard to hide. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for his accountant. He hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. Maybe there was something he could do. Maybe he could give her a raise or offer some kind of financial support. But he knew Grace wouldn't accept charity easily. She was proud, and whatever she was dealing with, she wanted to handle it on her own. James put the phone down, leaning back in his chair. He needed to think this through. He needed a plan that would help her without making her feel like she was losing control of her own life. He wasn't sure how to do that yet, but he was determined to find a way. Grace, on the other hand, was struggling to keep herself composed. She wiped down the counters, her hands shaking slightly. Maria, her colleague, noticed and approached her. "Grace, are you all right?" Maria's voice was gentle. Grace forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just long day." Maria didn't look convinced. "If you need to talk, I'm here, you know that." Grace nodded again, but her eyes were distant. "Thanks, Maria. I just need to get through tonight." Maria watched her for a moment before returning to her own work. Grace took a deep breath, trying to push down the panic that was threatening to take over. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now. Not ever. She was used to tough situations, but today felt different. It felt heavier, like the world was pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering how close she was to losing everything. James stayed in his study until he heard the last of the staff leave. He stood, looking out the window as Grace walked down the driveway, her head bowed. He clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. He had to find a way to help her, but he needed to do it right. He couldn't rush in and overwhelm her. He needed to show her that she could trust him, that he wanted to help because he cared, not because he felt obligated. James turned off the lights in his study, a plan slowly starting to form in his mind. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he had to try. Grace deserved better than this, and he was going to find a way to make things right. Grace was in the middle of preparing breakfast when she heard her name over the intercom. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Mr. James calling her to his office. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, her mind instantly jumping to the worst. Had she done something wrong? Was she about to be fired? She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly. When she reached the door to James's office, she took a deep breath and knocked. "Come in," James's voice called from the other side. Grace opened the door, stepping inside. James was sitting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat, Grace." Grace hesitated before sitting down. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to gauge what this was about. "Grace," James began, his tone softer than she expected. "I've noticed you've been under a lot of stress lately. I understand it's not my place to pry, but I wanted to offer you something." Grace's stomach churned. She kept her hands tightly folded in her lap, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. James, I appreciate your concern, but I don't think—" He held up a hand, stopping her. "I want to offer you a raise. It's not charity, it's because you're a valuable employee, and I believe you deserve it." Grace blinked, taken aback. A raise? It was the last thing she expected. Her immediate reaction was to refuse. She didn't want to feel indebted to him, and she certainly didn't want to depend on anyone else more than she already did. "Mr. James, I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "Just say yes, Grace. It would mean a lot to me if you'd accept it." James leaned forward, his eyes earnest. I know you're proud, but sometimes we all need a little help." Grace shook her head, her voice cracking slightly. "I appreciate it, but I can't. I don't want to be more of a burden." "You're not a burden," James said firmly. "You work harder than anyone here. This isn't about pity. It's about fairness." Grace stared at him, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to think about it. I'm sorry." James watched her go, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. He wanted to help, but he could see how deeply her pride ran. He knew this wouldn't be easy. When Grace got home that night, she felt more exhausted than usual. She sat on her worn-out couch, her head in her hands. The offer replayed in her mind over and over again. Part of her wanted to accept. It would help so much. But another part of her couldn't shake the feeling that accepting meant admitting she couldn't do it on her own. Her daughter came into the room, her small hand resting on Grace's shoulder. "Mommy, are you okay?" Grace looked up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. Just a long day." The little girl nodded and climbed onto Grace's lap, hugging her. Grace closed her eyes, holding her daughter close. She needed to figure this out, for her kids' sake. The next day, Grace found herself standing in front of James's office again. She took a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," James said. She entered, her heart pounding. James looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. "I've thought about your offer," Grace began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll accept it. But I don't want any special treatment." James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Of course, this is just me doing what I should have done a long time ago." Grace nodded, a mix of relief and anxiety washing over her. She turned to leave, but James's voice stopped her. "Grace," he said. She turned back to face him. "Thank you for trusting me." She gave him a faint smile before leaving the room. She had accepted his help, but when she checked her bank account later, she realized it wasn't enough to cover the tuition. The debt was bigger than she had thought. The disappointment settled heavily on her chest. She had let herself hope, only to be let down again. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The offer had seemed like a lifeline, but now it felt like a cruel joke. She had accepted help, and still, it wasn't enough. She didn't know how much longer she could keep doing this, fighting every day, only to fall short. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she saw a text from Maria. "Hey, just wanted you to know I'm here if you need anything. You're not alone, Grace." Grace sighed, her eyes welling up with tears. She didn't respond, but she appreciated the message. She needed to remind herself that she wasn't alone, even if it felt like it sometimes. The next morning, Grace got up, her body feeling heavy. She went through the motions, getting the kids ready, making breakfast, walking them to the bus stop. Her daughter hugged her tightly before getting on the bus, and Grace held on just a little longer. She needed to keep going. For them, no matter how hard it got. James sat in his office, going through some paperwork. His eyes kept drifting to the door, thinking about Grace. Something wasn't adding up, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was struggling more than she let on. He needed answers. He called his assistant, asking her to look into Grace's financial situation. It didn't take long before the assistant returned with information about a pending mortgage on Grace's home. The numbers were staggering. James felt a pang of guilt. He knew she had been dealing with something, but he hadn't realized the extent of it. Later, he found Grace in the kitchen, preparing lunch. She looked up when he entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. James," she said, quickly straightening up. "Grace, can we talk for a moment?" James's voice was gentle, but Grace tensed. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her heart pounding. James shook his head. "No, I know about the mortgage on your house." Grace's face went pale. She put down the knife she was holding, her hands trembling slightly. "How did you—" "I have my ways," James said, trying to smile. But Grace didn't return it. Instead, she looked down, her eyes filled with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want anyone to know." "Grace, you have nothing to be ashamed of," James said, stepping closer. "I want to help. Please, let me help you." Grace shook her head, her voice shaky. "I don't want more pity. I already feel like I'm drowning. I can't handle the thought of being even more dependent on someone else." James sighed, his expression softening. "This isn't pity, Grace. I genuinely care about you and your family. I don't want to see you suffer." Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She wanted to believe him, but it was hard. All her life, she had been let down by people who promised to help. It was hard to trust anyone, even someone as sincere as James seemed to be. "I need some time," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That evening, Grace sat down with her children, trying to keep her voice steady as she explained their situation. Her son, Marcus, listened quietly, his face growing darker with each word. "So, we might lose the house?" he asked, his voice rising. "Why didn't you tell us earlier?" "I didn't want you to worry," Grace said, her heart aching at the look on his face. Marcus stood up, his fists clenched. "This is all your fault. If you had a better job, we wouldn't be in this mess." Grace flinched, tears springing to her eyes. "Marcus, please, I'm doing the best I can." "Well, your best isn't good enough," he shouted, storming out of the room. Grace sat there, her head in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Her daughter, Emma, climbed onto her lap, wrapping her small arms around her. "It's okay, Mommy," Emma whispered. "We're going to be okay." Grace hugged her tightly, trying to believe her words. James, watching from a distance, felt his chest tighten. He wanted to do something, anything, to ease Grace's pain. But he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and he could push her away completely. The next day, Grace went to work with her head held high, trying to pretend that everything was normal. But she could feel the weight of the debt pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind elsewhere. James watched her from the doorway, his heart aching for her. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how without making her feel worse. He had never felt so helpless in his life. Later that day, James called Grace into his office again. She entered, her face tense. "Grace, I know you're struggling," James said, his voice gentle. "And I know you don't want to accept help. But please, just consider it." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be a burden, Mr. James. I already feel like I'm failing my kids." "You're not failing them," James said, his voice firm. "You're doing everything you can, and sometimes that means accepting help when it's offered." Grace looked away, her shoulders slumping. I don't know." James stood up, walking around his desk to stand in front of her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes meeting hers. "Grace, you're not alone. You have people who care about you. Please, let us help." Grace took a deep breath, her eyes closing. She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Okay, I'll accept your help." James smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "Thank you, Grace. You won't regret this." But as Grace left his office, she couldn't shake the feeling of shame that clung to her. She had accepted his help, but she still felt like she was failing. She didn't know how much longer she could keep doing this. That night, Grace sat on her bed, her head in her hands. She thought about everything: her children, her job, the mortgage, and James's offer. She felt like she was being pulled in a million different directions, and she didn't know which way to turn. But she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. Grace walked through her neighborhood, her eyes downcast. The whispers had begun. She could hear the neighbors talking about her. She caught snippets of their conversations as she walked past, words like debt and mortgage floating through the air. The weight of their judgment settled heavily on her shoulders. She kept her head down, pretending not to hear. But it hurt. The shame was unbearable. She reached her front door, her hands shaking slightly as she fumbled with the keys. She just wanted to be inside, away from the eyes of everyone else. "Grace!" a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Mrs. Thompson, her neighbor, standing by her fence. Grace forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson." Mrs. Thompson stepped closer, her expression almost pitying. "I heard about the situation with your house. I just wanted to say, well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." Grace swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you, but we're managing." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her eyes scanning Grace's face. "Just know that people are talking. Maybe it's time to consider your options, dear." Grace's forced smile faltered. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice tight. She quickly turned and went inside, closing the door behind her. She leaned against it, taking a deep breath. Her face burned with embarrassment. Her kids were in the living room, doing homework. She tried to smile as she walked in, but Marcus barely looked at her. He had been distant since their last conversation, and it broke her heart. She wanted to talk to him, to explain, but she knew he wouldn't listen. He was too angry, too frustrated. She went into the kitchen, starting on dinner. She moved mechanically, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, but her mind was somewhere else. The shame of being talked about, of her neighbors knowing her struggles, weighed heavily on her. At work the next day, she tried to keep her head up. She moved through her tasks as usual, but she could feel the exhaustion creeping in. She hadn't slept well the night before, her mind racing with thoughts of the debt, the whispers, her children. James walked into the kitchen, his eyes immediately finding Grace. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands moved slower than usual. He walked over to her, his voice soft. "Grace, can we talk for a moment?" Grace stiffened, her eyes not meeting his. "I'm busy, Mr. James. I need to finish this." "Grace, please," James said, his voice gentle. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "I don't want to talk, Mr. James. Please, just let me do my job." James sighed, nodding. "All right, but if you need anything, you know where to find me." Grace nodded, turning back to her work. She could feel his eyes on her, but she didn't look up. She didn't want to see the concern in his eyes. It made her feel weak, and she couldn't afford to feel that way right now. That evening, when Grace got home, she found an envelope on her doorstep. She picked it up, her heart sinking as she recognized the logo of the bank. She opened it, her eyes scanning the words. Eviction notice. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She felt her knees go weak, and she sank to the ground, the letter clutched in her hand. Her daughter, Emma, came running to her. "Mommy, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. Grace quickly wiped her eyes, trying to smile. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just some grown-up stuff." Emma looked at her, her eyes wide. "Are we going to be okay?" Grace forced herself to nod, her voice trembling. "Of course we are, baby, I promise." But inside, she felt like she was falling apart. She didn't know what to do. She was out of options, and the fear of losing everything was overwhelming. James found out about the eviction notice later that night. One of the staff had mentioned seeing the letter on Grace's doorstep. He felt his chest tighten. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. He needed to help her, whether she wanted it or not. The next day, James waited for Grace to arrive at work. When she walked in, her face pale and her eyes hollow, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to act, and he needed to do it now. James sat at his desk, the eviction notice lying in front of him. He couldn't let this happen. Grace and her children deserved better. He made up his mind. He was going to help her. And this time, he wouldn't take no for an answer. Later that morning, Grace entered the kitchen, her eyes tired and her shoulders slumped. She had spent the entire night worrying, wondering how she was going to keep her children safe. She barely noticed when James walked in, his expression serious. "Grace," he called softly. She looked up, startled. "Mr. James, I'm sorry. Grace, we need to talk. Please, come with me," he said, his voice firmer than usual. Grace hesitated, glancing at the other staff members who were now watching them curiously. She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before following him out of the kitchen. He led her to his office, closing the door behind them. James gestured for her to sit, but Grace remained standing, her eyes wary. "Mr. James, if this is about the eviction, James held up his hand. "Please, Grace, just listen to me." He took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers. "I want to help you, not just with the raise. I want to help you keep your home. I know you're proud, and I respect that. But I can't stand by and watch you struggle like this." Grace's face flushed. She looked away, her voice trembling. "I don't want to feel like a charity case, Mr. James. I've spent my whole life trying to stand on my own." James nodded, stepping closer. "I understand. But this isn't about charity. This is about giving you and your children a chance at stability. You deserve that, Grace. Your kids deserve that." Grace bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to argue, to refuse. But deep down, she knew he was right. She couldn't keep going like this. She was at her breaking point. What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can pay off the mortgage," James said, "and I can help you get back on your feet. But you need to trust me, Grace. You need to let me in." Grace closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking. Trust. It was such a simple word, yet it felt so impossible. She had been let down so many times before. But as she stood there, hearing the sincerity in James's voice, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to trust him. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Okay," she said, her voice cracking. "Okay, I'll accept your help. But please, don't make me regret it." James smiled, a look of relief washing over his face. "You won't regret it, Grace, I promise." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Grace went through her tasks, her mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. She felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of what accepting James's help might mean, and relief that, for once, she wasn't completely alone. That evening, when Grace got home, she gathered her children in the small living room. Marcus sat on the couch, his arms crossed, while Emma climbed onto Grace's lap. "Kids, I need to talk to you," Grace began, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling inside her. "I've been struggling with some things lately. The mortgage, the bills. It's been really hard." Marcus looked away, his jaw clenched. Grace reached out, placing a hand on his knee. "But I want you to know that things are going to get better. Mr. James is going to help us. We're going to keep our home, and I need you both to be strong for me, okay?" Marcus looked at her, his eyes softening. He nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. I was scared." Grace hugged him, her own tears spilling over. "I know, sweetheart. I was scared too, but we're going to get through this, together." Emma hugged her tightly, her small voice full of hope. "We're going to be okay, Mommy." Grace smiled, kissing her daughter's head. "Yes, baby, we're going to be okay." The next day, James met with Grace during their lunch break. They sat in his office, a plan laid out in front of them. James explained how they would work through the mortgage, how he would help her stabilize her finances. Grace listened, nodding, a mix of hope and uncertainty in her eyes. James reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "We'll do this together, Grace. You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you, James. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to," James said softly. "Just let me be here for you. That's all I want." For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't easy, accepting someone's help. But as she sat there, with James by her side, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything on her own. Grace walked through the front door of her home, a feeling of strange calm settling over her. She was still nervous about the future, about accepting James's help. But something had changed. There was a lightness in her chest, as if the crushing weight had been lifted, even if just a little. She glanced at her children, who were watching TV on the couch. They looked up as she walked in, and she could see the uncertainty in their eyes. "Hey, kids," she said, her voice warm. "Come here, I want to talk to you." Emma jumped up immediately, while Marcus hesitated for a moment before standing and walking over. Grace sat on the floor, motioning for them to join her. "I want you both to know something," she began, looking from one child to the other. "We've been through some hard times lately, but things are going to get better. I accepted Mr. James's help, and we're going to work together to fix things. We won't have to worry about losing the house anymore." Emma smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Really, Mommy?" Grace nodded, her heart swelling at the hope in her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart, really." Marcus looked down at his feet, his face serious. Are we really going to be okay, Mom?" Grace reached over, ruffling his hair. "Yes, Marcus, I promise. But I need your help too. I need you both to be patient with me and to help me around the house. We're a team, okay?" Marcus nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Okay, Mom, I'll help." Grace pulled both of her children into her arms, holding them tightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were going to make it. The next day, Grace walked into work with her head held a little higher. She still felt nervous, but there was also a sense of determination. She wasn't alone anymore. James had offered his help, and she was going to make the most of it. As she moved through her tasks in the kitchen, James entered, catching her eye. He gave her a small smile, nodding in her direction. Grace nodded back, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew it was going to be a long road, but at least she had someone by her side. During their break, James called her into his office. He had laid out some documents on the desk, and he gestured for her to sit. "Grace, I want to go over the plan with you," he said, his voice gentle. "This is your life, and I want you to feel comfortable with everything we're doing." Grace nodded, her eyes scanning the papers. She could see the breakdown of the mortgage, the payment plan that James had arranged. It was still overwhelming, but seeing everything laid out in front of her made it seem a little more manageable. James watched her carefully, his voice soft. "I know this is a lot, Grace, but I want you to know that I'm here every step of the way." Grace looked up, meeting his eyes. "Thank you, James. I don't know how to thank you enough." James smiled, shaking his head. "You don't need to thank me, Grace. Just focus on you and your kids. That's all that matters." Later that afternoon, James walked Grace out to her car. As they stood by the driver's side door, he looked at her, his expression serious. "I know this is just the beginning," he said, his voice low. "But I want you to know that you're not alone. I'll be here for as long as you need me." Grace looked up at him, her heart swelling. She felt a warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you, James. That means more than you'll ever know." The days that followed were filled with small moments of hope. Grace began to see the light at the end of the tunnel. She worked hard, both at the mansion and at home, but for once, it felt like her efforts were paying off. One evening, James stopped by Grace's house. He had brought some groceries, insisting that it was just a small gesture. Grace invited him in, and for the first time, James met her children properly. Emma was excited to meet him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Marcus, though still a little unsure, was polite, shaking James's hand. "Thank you for helping my mom," Marcus said, his voice quiet but sincere. James smiled, nodding. "It's my pleasure, Marcus. Your mom is an amazing person, and I'm happy to help however I can." They spent the evening together, James helping Grace cook dinner while the kids set the table. It was a simple meal, but it felt like so much more. The house was filled with warmth and laughter, something that had been missing for so long. As they sat down to eat, Grace looked around the table, her heart full. For the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. After dinner, as James was getting ready to leave, he turned to Grace, his voice soft. "You know, you're stronger than you realize, Grace. The way you've handled everything, the way you care for your kids, it's incredible." Grace felt her face flush, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know about that. I've just been doing what I have to do." James shook his head, stepping a little closer. "No, it's more than that. You're an amazing mother, and an amazing person." Grace swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a long time. "Thank you, James," she whispered, her voice trembling. James smiled, his eyes soft. "Anytime, Grace. Anytime." As he left, Grace stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the driveway. She felt a warmth in her chest, a feeling of hope and something else, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The next few weeks brought a kind of stability that Grace hadn't experienced in years. With James's help, she managed to make the mortgage payments and catch up on bills. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest slowly began to lift, allowing her to breathe a little easier each day. She could see the difference in her children, too. Emma was smiling more, and Marcus seemed less angry. They both returned to school, their confidence slowly rebuilding. Grace felt a sense of relief wash over her every morning as she watched them get on the school bus, knowing they were safe and taken care of. James continued to be there, his support unwavering. He would check in with her daily, making sure she was okay and helping her where he could. Sometimes he'd show up at her doorstep with groceries, or he'd offer to help her fix something around the house. Grace found herself looking forward to those visits more and more. One Saturday afternoon, James stopped by unexpectedly. Grace was in the kitchen, organizing her bills, when she heard the knock at the door. She opened it to find James standing there, holding a small potted plant. "For your home," he said with a smile, handing it to her. Grace laughed, taking the plant from him. "You really don't need to keep bringing me things, James." "I know," James said, his eyes softening, "but I want to. I like doing things for you, Grace." Grace felt her face flush, her heart skipping a beat. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Well, thank you. It's beautiful." James followed her into the kitchen, his eyes glancing at the papers on the table. "Are those the bills?" he asked, nodding toward them. Grace sighed, nodding. "Yeah, I'm just trying to get everything organized. It's a lot, but it's getting better." James smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "You're doing great, Grace. I mean it." Grace smiled back, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you, James. I couldn't have done any of this without you." James waved a hand dismissively. "You could have." It just would have taken longer. But I'm glad I could help. Grace set the plant on the counter, turning back to face him. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. Would you like to stay for dinner? It's not much, but I'd love to have you. James's eyes lit up, and he nodded. I'd love that, Grace. Grace spent the rest of the afternoon preparing dinner while James sat at the kitchen table, talking with her. They talked about everything, work, the kids, even James's childhood. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years, the sound filling the small kitchen. When dinner was ready, Grace called the kids. Emma and Marcus came rushing into the kitchen, their eyes lighting up when they saw James. Mr. James, Emma said, her face breaking into a wide grin. You're here again. James smiled, nodding. I am. Your mom invited me for dinner. Emma looked up at Grace, her eyes twinkling. You're the best, Mommy. Grace chuckled, shaking her head. All right. Let's all sit down and eat. They gathered around the table, and for a moment, Grace just looked at them all, her heart swelling. This was what she had wanted for so long. Her kids happy, a home filled with laughter and warmth. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than she could have asked for. As they ate, James turned to Marcus. So, how's school going, Marcus? Marcus shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. It's okay. Better than before, I guess. Grace watched the exchange, her chest tightening with emotion. Marcus had been so angry for so long, and seeing him open up, even just a little, made her heart swell with pride. That's good to hear, James said, nodding. You're a smart kid, Marcus. I know you can do great things. Marcus blushed slightly, looking down at his plate. Thanks, Mr. James. After dinner, they all sat in the living room, talking and laughing. Emma showed James her drawing from school, while Marcus talked about his favorite books. James listened intently, his eyes filled with genuine interest. Grace sat back, watching them all, her heart full. It felt almost surreal, having someone like James in her life, someone who genuinely cared about her and her children. She hadn't realized how much she needed that until now. As the evening drew to a close, James stood, stretching his arms. I should get going. It's getting late. Grace walked him to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want him to leave, but she knew she couldn't ask him to stay. Thank you for coming, James, she said, her voice soft. James smiled, his eyes meeting hers. Thank you for having me, Grace. I had a great time. They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Grace could feel the warmth in her chest, the feeling of something more. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. James, I just want you to know how much this means to me. You being here, helping us, it means everything. James's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his voice gentle. Grace, you mean a lot to me. You and your kids. I'm happy to be here, and I want to keep being here. Grace felt her heart skip a beat, her eyes meeting his. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the warmth and care. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I want that too. James smiled, reaching out to gently touch her arm. Then let's take it one day at a time. We'll figure it out together. Grace nodded, a smile spreading across her face. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, truly hopeful. She watched as James walked down the driveway, a warmth spreading through her chest. She closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, her heart pounding. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something real, something she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in a long time. As she turned back to the living room, she saw Marcus and Emma looking at her, their eyes wide. Is Mr. James going to be around more? Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. Grace smiled, nodding. Yeah, sweetheart. I think he will. Emma grinned, jumping up and down. Yay! I like Mr. James. Grace laughed, pulling her children into her arms. I like him too, baby. I like him too. The three of them sat there, holding each other, and for the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself to feel at peace. They weren't alone anymore. They had James, and together, they were going to be okay. Grace woke up early, the morning light filtering through her bedroom window. She stretched, feeling an unfamiliar sense of calm. Today felt different. It wasn't that all their problems had disappeared, but things were starting to change. She could feel it. She got out of bed, heading to the kitchen to start breakfast. As she cracked eggs into a bowl, she heard the sound of small footsteps behind her. Morning, Mommy, Emma said, rubbing her sleepy eyes. Morning, sweetheart, Grace said, smiling. How did you sleep? Emma climbed onto one of the chairs, resting her head on her hands. Good. Are we seeing Mr. James today? Grace paused, her heart fluttering. She wasn't sure. James had mentioned stopping by, but they hadn't made definite plans. Still, she found herself hoping he would. Maybe, she said, smiling at Emma. We'll see. Emma beamed, her eyes lighting up. I hope so. Grace finished making breakfast, and Marcus eventually joined them at the table. They ate together, the atmosphere light and comfortable. Grace felt a warmth in her chest, the feeling of a small but meaningful victory. Just as they were finishing breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Grace's heart skipped a beat, and Emma jumped up, running to the door. Mr. James! She shouted as she opened it. James stood there, smiling, a bag of groceries in his hand. Morning, everyone. Emma wrapped her arms around his waist, and James laughed, ruffling her hair. Good to see you too, Emma. Grace stood up, wiping her hands on a towel as she walked over. Morning, James, she said, her voice soft. Morning, Grace, James replied, his eyes meeting hers. There was a warmth there, something that made Grace feel both nervous and excited. Come in, she said, stepping aside to let him in. James walked in, setting the bag of groceries on the counter. I thought I'd bring some things over. Figured we could cook something together later. Grace smiled, her heart swelling. You didn't have to do that, but thank you. The kids will love it. James turned to Marcus, who was still sitting at the table, a shy smile on his face. Morning, Marcus. Morning, Mr. James, Marcus said, his voice quiet but friendly. Think you could help me with some of these groceries later? James asked, raising an eyebrow. Marcus nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. Sure. The morning passed in a comfortable blur. Grace and James worked together in the kitchen, preparing lunch while Emma and Marcus played in the living room. They moved around each other with ease, James handing Grace ingredients, their hands brushing occasionally. Each time they did, Grace felt her heart skip a beat, a warmth spreading through her chest. They ate lunch together, and afterwards, James suggested they take a walk. It was a sunny day, and Grace hadn't realized how much she needed the fresh air until they were outside. She walked next to James, her children running ahead, their laughter filling the air. Thank you for coming over, Grace said, her voice soft. It means a lot to us. James looked at her, his eyes warm. It means a lot to me too, Grace. I like being here, with you and the kids. Grace felt her face flush, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at James, her voice hesitant. Do you think this could be more? I mean, you and me. James stopped, turning to face her. He reached out, taking her hand gently. Grace, I've wanted that for a while now, but I wanted to wait until you were ready. Grace looked down at their joined hands, her eyes stinging with tears. She took a deep breath, looking up at him. "I think I'm ready, James. I want this. I want us." James smiled, his eyes softening. "Then let's take this one step at a time. Together." Grace nodded, her heart swelling. She squeezed his hand, a smile spreading across her face. They continued walking, their hands still joined, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt like everything was going to be okay. As they reached the park, Marcus and Emma ran ahead to the swings. Grace and James sat on a bench, watching the kids play. James leaned back, glancing at Grace. "You know, you're doing an amazing job, Grace. I hope you know that." Grace smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know about amazing, I'm just doing my best." "That's all anyone can do," James said, his voice gentle. "And your best is pretty incredible." Grace felt her heart swell, a warmth spreading through her chest. She looked over at her children, their laughter echoing in the air. This was what she had wanted for so long: stability, happiness, and maybe even love. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and sunshine. James stayed for dinner, and Grace felt the warmth of his presence filling their home. The kids adored him, and Grace could see how much he cared about them. He wasn't just helping her. He was becoming a part of their family. As the evening drew to a close, James stood at the door, getting ready to leave. Grace walked him out, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want him to leave, but she knew they had to take things slowly. "Thank you for today," she said, her voice soft. "It was perfect." James smiled, stepping closer. "I'm glad. I had a great time." They stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Grace could feel her heart pounding, the warmth of James's presence filling the space between them. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly. "James, I just want you to know that I'm really glad you're here." James smiled, his eyes softening. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I'm glad I'm here too, Grace, and I'm not going anywhere." Grace felt her heart swell, a smile spreading across her face. She leaned in, her lips brushing against his cheek. James's eyes widened slightly, but then he smiled, his hand resting on her arm. "I'll see you soon, Grace," he whispered. "See you soon," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched as he walked down the driveway, a warmth spreading through her chest. She turned back to the house, her heart pounding, and as she closed the door behind her, she felt a sense of peace, a sense that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. She walked back into the living room, her children looking up at her, their eyes wide. "Is Mr. James going to be around more?" Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. Grace smiled, nodding. "Yeah, sweetheart, I think he will." Emma grinned, jumping up and down. "Yay, I like Mr. James." Grace laughed, pulling her children into her arms. "I like him too, baby." "I like him too." They sat there, holding each other, and for the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself to feel at peace. They weren't alone anymore. They had James, and together, they were going to be okay. The beginning of something new had finally arrived, and Grace knew that, step by step, they would build a life filled with hope, love, and stability. A new chapter had begun for them all, and she was ready to face whatever came their way, because this time, they would face it together.